Make a start. So hello from London and welcome to Global Government Fintech's webinar, Fintech and the Future, where is the greatest potential for central government's use of Fintech solutions? My name's Ian Hall. I'm the editor of Global Government Fintech, a sister title to Global Government Forum. Both our publications report on innovation in the public sector to serve our core audience of public servants around the world. We have a weekly editorial newsletter. We're also active on social media. We encourage you to give Global Government Fintech a follow on LinkedIn to get the latest updates. We're easily findable there, and we're putting our LinkedIn link in the chat box now, which hopefully you can all see as I do this introduction. I just wanted to set the scene a little before we hear from today's three panelists, which is how does Global Government Fintech tackle the topic that we're looking at. I thought it could be helpful to show the topic sections that our editorial team cover. So hopefully appearing on the screen, there we go. If you look over on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see how we attempt to break down the kind of fintech in government world. And you can see those sections are artificial intelligence, blockchain, cybercrime and security, data, digital currencies, fraud, error and debt, ID verification, open banking and open finance, payments, policy and governance, which is where we touch on regulation, and resilience, which includes, for example, financial inclusion and also the emerging world of green fintech. I imagine the discussion that we're looking forward to now will cut across most, although probably not all of those topics. So on one hand, fintech can seem quite narrow, but actually when you look at the topic sections, it's quite a large patch and also a growing one. The webinar today seeks to evolve a little an event that we held in Estonia, in Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, on the 1st of June, where two of our three panelists, Doris in Germany and Andres from Spain, came out to Estonia to speak at that event. So we're seeking to evolve what we looked at there a little bit, and looking at how government authorities worldwide are interested in using fintech services or embedding fintech solutions into their operations to improve what they do and deliver better services. So during the webinar, we're seeking to explore questions including what areas do we see as being most interesting for governments exploring fintech solutions at the moment? What areas do we see as being most interesting for governments exploring fintech solutions in the future? And also, what obstacles are there at the moment as well? We're going to begin with observations from Doris, Chris and Andres in that order, but we aim to save about half the time for questions for you, our worldwide audience. When you have a question, just click on the Q&A button at the bottom of Zoom and type them in. Do add a note if you don't want me to use your name when I ask the question. Please note the webinar is being recorded for later circulation, and we do have a hashtag, which is appropriately govts using fintech. That's what we've been using for the promotion for today. But let's begin with opening comments from our three panelists. So first we'll go to Germany and hear from Doris Dietzer, who is Head of Digital Finance, Payment Services and Cybersecurity in the Federal Ministry of Finance. So Doris, over to you.
Thank you, Ian, for the invitation and the possibility to join this panel on this interesting topic, how central governments could use fintech solutions in their daily work. I think there are two aspects one have to look at when it comes to this topic. The first is, does the government provide for a fintech ecosystem itself? And second is government ready, or how does government innovate, or how does government do digital transform their services? And that two aspects put together lead naturally to the questions, what are maybe the chances or the restraints when both comes together, governments and fintechs? In Germany, we did a lot during the last years to foster a lively fintech ecosystem, because fintechs in themselves are important for us to innovate financial services and can contribute to innovation and growth to stay competitive. And that is why a lively fintech ecosystem itself has a value. That is why in the Ministry of Finance launched a Digital Finance Forum this year, where we do have all the fintech experts from the traditional firms as well as startups working together and outlining an upcoming agenda of what can be done in Germany to foster innovation and also to serve for a valid and sound framework for fintechs. The second thing we did is we published recently a startup strategy, because some of the fintechs, of course, are startups too. The strategy is not only valid for fintechs, but also as long as they are startups. And they propose different measures how to improve the startup system in Germany, ecosystem as a whole. And that lead as one of the first consequences to a future, we call it in German, Future Financing Act, which is on the agenda now. And the first draft got to be published this week. And this should foster or facilitate access to capital and financing, forms of financing for fintechs in order to support their growth. And then is also a last point I would like to mention is that these initiatives got supplemented by regional initiative tools. We have several regional fintech hubs in Germany where services can accelerate and also facilitate their work. So basically, this is the first aspect where we see if a government wants to use fintechs, first of all, they have to have some or a choice of them in their country, which they have the possibility to rely on. The second part is how do governments innovate? Because we do see, of course, that some of the solutions could be relevant for governments. That's not only true for fintech solution, but for other digital solution as well. For example, digital identities or similar things, or we're talking about blockchain and registers. However, we do see that we also need a different approach to how does government or government agencies want to provide their services to the greater public. And there's, I think, a lot already done. However, there's still work to do and things which could be improved to get more digital in the end, and to have new approaches towards a better service for the public. And in this regard, we do some work in the Ministry of Finance too. We have an innovation hub here to also, which basically has the idea that the civil servants and the people working here in the ministry get new ideas on how to improve or how to vary and develop their digital awareness when it comes to legislation, but also when it comes to non-legislative measures. We also, what we did also is to provide for fellowships, digital fellowships, to improve technological knowledge throughout the ministry and throughout the government. Because of course, if governments want to use fintech solutions, they have to be aware of what they are using and how does it function and how could it be implemented in their traditional services. And the last but not least thing is that we kind of have digital agent, I would call them. So in every greater policy area, there are some people who are the responsible or are the experts on digital services and also technology itself, which also includes not only technology, but also our different forms of working together to improve, to improve and allow for digital transformation in the government itself. If you now put these two things together, a lively fintech ecosystem from economic view, and also the way governments or agencies do innovate more or are trained to innovate, we see that there are potentials for fintech solutions in governments. How I would put it, in theory, there are a lot of possibilities, and I would like to name one. In practice, it gets a bit more complex. But of course, we do see that, especially in the field of payments, when it comes to government payments, that also payment initiation services or other solutions could play an important role. When it comes to government loans or grants, something we had discussed very lively during COVID, where governments rolled out loan programs for businesses. That could be done via traditional banks. That could be done also in cooperation with the lending platforms, for example. We also see, when we look at regulatory agencies, artificial intelligence can play a huge role when it comes to AML or TF supervision. And as I already mentioned, the blockchain application could have an important role when it comes to the digitalization of register solutions, and registers, something at least in Germany we have a lot of. And some of them are even paper-based. So there is potential for digital solution and fintech solutions. And last but not least, digital identities, which is not a pure fintech solution. However, there's probably no payment solution without identity. So that could be one of the important things too. So that's the areas where, well, some examples for some areas. However, when we look on all these areas more closely, on then how to get these things in work, we see at least that there are in practice some limitations which results from the factor that there's a governmental agency or a government which is bound to certain frameworks, restrictions, regulations, which make it a bit more complex compared to private cooperation, to put it like that. And I just want to mention some of them. The first thing, of course, governments themselves always ask whether that is a service they should provide by themselves and offer them by themselves, or whether that could be a service where you can include private solutions. And that could be done in different forms too. You can, and there are many reasons where or many cases where you may come to the conclusion that the government itself should provide also a technical solution. However, you also can think about cooperations, like private-public partnerships, where governmentals and together with private partners or fintechs could provide a service. But you always, or governments themselves always have to ask themselves whether that is a real sound and reliable solution, which is usable for the greater public itself, and whether it's cost efficient. And cost efficiency is a very high principle when it comes to governmental tasks and doings. Because, well, we have actually to prove everything, whether there's a less costly alternative, because we have a court of auditors and we have a parliament which we have to rely on. And therefore, every cooperation with privates always has a budget implication, so to say. That's the second point. The third point is cooperations also do always have a procurement perspective. So especially as an official and public institution, we are clearly bound by public procurement law. And that also has could have some implications on whom we could choose or not choose for certain services or for certain corporations. And one of the criteria in this procurement law is, for example, that the company we are cooperating with has a sound and reliable company structure, which is normally the case for every traditional big company on the market. However, when it comes to startups, there could be the case that if you have a fast growing company, as a small company, that you somehow have to estimate whether the service you buy in is not only reliable for 1 year, but also for the next 10 years, for example. So these are kind of questions we as governments have to ask us before we cooperate or engage or buy in fintech solutions. And that is kind of different, or this is different to purely private corporations and purely private solutions in this field. So basically, to sum it up, we see that fintechs could play an important role with government solution. And we also experienced during COVID that when there's a kind of, I would say, crisis, the awareness to have something which works fast and efficient and completely digital is something which could maybe easier be provided by a private company than by the government itself. However, we still see that we can learn something from fintechs in this regard as a government, especially when it comes to the question how to innovate and how to be more digital. On the other side, we also see that fintechs can probably also learn from governments what their specific role is when it comes to the offering of public services, which is always a bit a different task compared to providing for private service. Because we have always bear in mind that it has to work for everyone, it's reliable, and that it fits for the population in a whole or as a whole. So these are basically, well, the end of my story, so to say. There is a lot of potential, and there's, I think, a lot to learn from each other. And there are some minor things to solve, or maybe also to adapt in future to make it easier to have such corporations. Yeah. Thank you.
No, thank you, Doris. That's an excellent kind of introduction of all the different topics and kind of challenges, I guess, that people in roles similar to yours and that are watching the webinar now, I guess, kind of identify with. And I think you've probably mentioned at least half of the kind of topic areas from I don't know, AI to payments that we do cover. It struck me as you were speaking certainly about kind of COVID relief payments. Global Government Fintech and our sister title, Global Government Forum, held another webinar a couple of days ago specifically on kind of partly focus. It was about kind of government payments during how they're kind of evolving, which obviously touched a lot on kind of COVID relief payments. So if anyone's watching the webinar who's specifically interested in that topic, I'm sure you can find a recording already of that webinar on the website. Also, you mentioned digital ID, which we've organised various webinars on, and I know it's kind of a bit fintech, but a bit not. But it's amazing how often in the webinars we do that kind of a lot of countries lack of digital ID, but it's kind of an emerging digital ID ecosystem and meshes with fintech as well. And also interesting, you mentioned the procurement challenges, I guess, as well. Again, I think we have another webinar coming up next year that looks at specifically looks at kind of fintech, the challenges of kind of fintech procurement. So thank you, Doris, for that introduction for Germany. We're now going to come to London, where Chris Dix, who is the Chief Technology Officer for UKSV, which Chris, I'm sure, will explain. He joined the UK Cabinet Office early this year in that role. So, Chris, over to you for your initial reflections.
Thanks, Ian, and hi to everybody out there. So, as Ian said, I'm reasonably new to government. I've been in government close to about 8 months. But previously, I was at the BBC. Where we applied a number of fintech technologies in some areas of the businesses. So I think a lot of the application of fintech and the challenges around fintech are pretty generic, to be honest, certainly across public sector organizations as such. So as you sort of look at technologies and capabilities across this sort of portfolio, there's clearly a really rich portfolio of fintech capabilities, which opens up a broad set of innovation opportunities for government. And if I was to consider the fintech portfolio of capabilities as such, I would be including in my periphery of that would be mobile banking, payments, opportunities around blockchain, looking at what we do with big data, as all of our, the number of data points that we have is just growing every day. And it presents a different problem in terms of how we manage and how we use that data effectively, rather than just storing it. Hyper-automation is huge. I think that really helps us, and we'll dig into that. We'll dig into that in a bit more in a minute, because I think there's some really interesting considerations around that. RegTech is really interesting. Something I've not looked into too much, but in terms of how we start considering sort of regulatory technologies, how do we keep on top of things like fraud management, those sorts of things are really interesting opportunities for us to dig into. Some of which I think might be a little bit too early for us. But there are other technologies and capabilities out there that bring different levels of maturity and application for us to help consider how we might apply them as such. Two other capabilities within the sort of landscape of fintech that interest me, and I think opportunities around biometrics and also open banking. So for me, the particular domain that I work in, which is UK security vetting, I would consider, there's a couple I would consider as priorities for me, and I would cover hyper-automation, biometrics, and open banking to be probably my top priorities in terms of where my strategic priorities sit at the moment. And as far as the sort of fintech selection, we need to really consider how do we not just select them, but how do we apply them? What are the things that we need to worry about? So if I focus on hyper-automation at the moment, hyper-automation really lends itself to opportunities that deliver the types of experience, such as chatbots, branching narrative experiences, all of which help us replace things like repetitive, low value, high volume tasks. All of these can really help increase the citizen experience and generate new capacity that we didn't have before. But what's the change impact of the business? So it can't always be a tech question. And how do we do things like, how do we redistribute the workforce? How do we also ensure that we still maintain a certain level of knowledge within the business? So in terms of what we're doing, we know that the application of these technologies is still true and meeting the outcomes that we need. So managing the impact of applying fintech is really key, a really key consideration for me. Also, a really complex situation is around, for me, is when we think about deep learning. So by using deep learning effectively, we need a way of generating the right feedback loops into a neural network in order to generate new learnings. But how do we do that in the right way, especially when we're using shared models? So things that I've been looking at are techniques such as federated learning at scale, which, federated learning is a thing, but is it really available at scale? Is it truly understood? I'm not sure. How do we protect the data that goes into these models, and that they're being treated appropriately? But I've done quite a bit of work in this area, and it's there are companies out there that probably share the right ethical thoughts in terms of how we use data in the right way. Some others maybe not as much, because it's a different business model for them. So there's some real considerations there. Biometric tech, that brings really good opportunity for us in my space around understanding things like enhanced security and identity verification. And that sort of tech's been on the market for a significant period of time. So I'd say the maturity in the application of that is quite broad. So I'd say that's a reasonable technology to look at. So recently I was reading an article suggesting that there's in the region of over 14,000 fintech startups. And whilst they're all out there, we need to consider actually how mature are those offerings within that capability landscape. What do they actually offer? How is the data that we collect? How is it used, managed? How are things like how are privacy observed? What's the learning abilities of technology? It's all very easy to dress something up and make it shiny, but actually, what outcomes does it bring us? So the question for me is how do we validate these offerings against security and privacy as an example of two dimensions of measuring maturity and relevance in this area? also these, these technologies as a combination, it really unlocks so many innovation opportunities that enables us to launch new products and services. So they cannot be ignored. They are really decent enablers for us to pivot and do things differently. But we also have to have a well-defined approach that addresses those security and privacy concerns when selecting fintech capabilities. There are also other additional opportunities that we've got. I think, Doris, you might have touched on them, around working with academia, which not only enables us to innovate at scale, but also enables us to deliver value back into academia and also society. But again, we have to consider the types of data sets we're handling, how we're processing them, the ethical treatment around those things as well. But there's a real opportunity to leverage those types of business models. And as Doris pointed out in her opening remarks, there is this potential, there is this huge landscape of enabling innovation. But we have procurement frameworks to go through, and we have to ensure that our choices are cost effective, they demonstrate good value for public money. And I think there's not really an off-the-shelf quick win in a lot of these. So I think in government, it's really good for us to observe. It's good to work within the market, work within academia, identify the right technologies. If there's a bucket of 14,000 capabilities out there, we need to be able to sift through using quite a robust framework to make sure we're making the right choices for the right reasons, and not just because it's maybe the shiniest of things out there. So for me, that's sort of my view on the opportunities that fintech brings for us.
Chris, thanks so much for that intro. Again, I think you've thrown in a few new potential topic sections for global government fintech there, because I don't feel I'm the title's covering some of those yet in the detail that maybe they deserve. I've just got one reaction, which, and it partly picks up on something that Doris has also said, which is you've referred to that figure of 14,000, I think, fintech startups. I suppose a lot of fintech solutions are actually proposed by some of the world's kind of biggest tech and financial services firms. So I suppose, I don't know whether that number kind of all actually, if it is just startup, then therefore by definition it excludes some of the solutions. But I remember, Doris, I don't know, you mentioned it back in Estonia in June, that the Digital Finance Forum, I think, used to be called the Fintech Forum in Germany, but it's kind of been renamed in order to acknowledge that a lot of the fintech solutions can come from the biggest firms as well. So, and I don't know, there's various kind of comments and questions off that, but I suppose one of the challenges we often hear from smaller fintechs is they're not aware of the opportunities within government. They're not able to navigate those opportunities, whereas actually the bigger organizations tend to be, plugged into those networks. Before we come to Andres, I don't know if either Doris or Chris just want to come back on that, how that balance between the fintech solutions that are visible and out there, balance between the smaller fintechs that may, I don't know, struggle to pass due diligence checks, whatever, and the bigger solutions. Chris, do you want to go?
Yeah, it's hard. It is hard because you want to be able to interact with the smaller businesses. You want to be able to help enhance their products, bring good value back into the market. But I think it's realistic that sometimes startups cannot be as agile as we need them to be, and sometimes there's a huge amount of work for them to meet the prerequisites for a government organization to be able to use technology in a certain way, and sometimes that can be too much. So I think through innovation schemes, or we're putting out challenges to market and those sorts of things are interesting, whereas, or co-funding and those to create that safety net for startups to be able to operate within the right conditions is something I'm really, really conscious of. So it is hard, but there are mechanisms to support the smaller organizations as well. But some of the bigger organizations are also quite difficult to navigate as well, because they maybe are much larger, but maybe still not as agile in some cases, because of their direction of travel is their direction of travel, and there's no sort of navigating away from that. So I think there's challenges on both degrees.
Yeah, that's a good point. Doris, do you have any reactions on that that kind of balance between the fintech solutions coming from fintechs, but also fintech solutions coming from some of the world's biggest companies?
Yes, I think you raise a very important point in here. That is something we see actually in other areas as well, when small competes against big, so to say. Of course, for smaller companies, it is most of the time more difficult to meet, as Chris said, the prerequisites of procurement procedures, or even some other governmental programs. And it's due to less resources for them, often more or not that easy to find even all the information they need together. So that's something we also see in other areas. The same is true for any licensing procedure we see in financial market regulation, which is very risk-based. However, we do see that smaller companies, of course, it's a bigger effort for them to go through I would say, normal licensing procedure than it is for most of the big techs, because they have a different amount of resources which could just cover these things and could engage with this. If you have someone whose only task is to deal with procurement procedures, or to gather together all the information about public financing programs, that it is a much more comfortable position than if there are only, well, a few people running the whole business. So I think that's an imbalance which we are aware of, and which we try to tackle so far, that we try to have always in mind, as in the Digital Finance Forums, that we also address smaller businesses and startups, and not only bigger firms. And that we try to provide specific information for them, which is easy to find and to handle. Yeah.
So just to summarize that, then, in Germany, it's now called the Digital Finance Forum, is the forum, and it used to be called the Fintech Council? Sorry,
Yes, exactly. It's now the Digital Finance Forum. It's a different set of members, and it differs a bit from the working plan. But yeah, you're totally right. Before, it was a FinTech Council, we called it. Yeah, and we broadened the scope and the memberships.
Great. So no, thanks, Doris. Right, let's go over then to Madrid and hear from Andres. Before we do, I just want to say to the online audience that we're here to welcome your questions. So I have some questions, of course, up my sleeve, but the aim is for get everyone watching online to engage and send us some questions. So you can do that via, I think it's the Q&A button at the bottom. So please fire them in. But now we go over to Andres in Madrid, who is Chief of Staff in the Spanish Treasury, which is in the Ministry for Economic Affairs and Digital Transformation. Andres, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ian. It is a pleasure to participate in this dialogue and in this forum, because with colleagues and people that is fully engaged in the huge challenge that we're facing. It is always something we can learn, and to see how solutions are being implemented somewhere else. In this case, in Germany, in the UK, and also in Estonia back in June. It was a very insightful experience, and I'm very grateful for the organization. As I mentioned, I think it's a huge challenge, and the question on how are governments right now using or introducing fintech in their management, in their activity, in the way we regulate. It's a very difficult question to answer, because fintech solutions are a developing technology. We've seen through the last years some technologies are already being implemented in the private sector. Some are also being introduced or being analyzed in the public sector. But it is a very important challenge, and we're very interested in introducing and to have the better experience, and we know there are a lot of advantages that we can get from these technologies, but we need at least to focus on two main areas, which from our side, which is the regulator point of view. We need technologies to be safer, to be to guarantee not only that in the private sector will work, but also in the public sector. And when we introduce these technologies for the public sector, it is even harder. The regulation is tougher, and in some areas, such as the financial sector, which is very closely regulated, in the public sector, anything that is related to spending, to money, to payments are or it's even more difficult to introduce, and the steps you have ahead are many, and so we are engaged in this challenge, and I think it's very useful to learn what are we doing in each country. So as I mentioned, as regulators, we have the responsibility to introduce, to analyze, to keep up with the technologies, because otherwise we will lose what the private sector is doing, what the technologies, what people are is demanding, and there are many areas in which some fintech solutions are very well appreciated, and it can be very, very useful for the private sector. And I think this is a very important message. There are some technologies that within the government implementing and taking full advantage of them will be very useful. But first, there is something we need to guarantee, which is the regulatory framework in which these technologies can be implemented. So I would just like to highlight like three main ideas in these initial remarks. The first one is that we need to establish first an appropriate regulatory framework for easier and safer technologies to be implemented, first in the private sector or in the as a whole, and then also in the public sector. This means at least two steps on the regulation, and this is very important. I will say we're right now in the first step. And this is the second idea I want to highlight. We are in the first step, introducing the proper regulation for these technologies to be implemented in our society and to be analyzed from the authorities, from the supervisors, and there is a lot of progress that is being done through probably the last 4 or 5 years in this area, and both at the European level with the MiCA regulation, with DORA, with the DLT pilot regime. There is a huge amount of resources that is being put in place for these technologies to be regulated, to be introduced, to make them safe, and to guarantee that it can work properly. But also at the national level, we have here in Spain the experience of financial regulatory sandbox, which we are in the 4th court now. We've only had this sandbox for 2 years, and almost 100 companies have applied for the sandbox, which is a lot of companies. It's not the 14,000 startups in fintech, but so few of them are, at least a few of them are in the regulatory sandbox here in Spain. But also not only just in sandbox, but also in other areas such as the market securities law, some improvements that are being introduced in the management of the payments in the government, and there are a lot of technologies that are being introduced in order to digitalize the processes also in the treasury. And And as Chris and Doris were already mentioning, when we are talking about fintech solutions or fintech collaboration with the governments, we are not, or it is very difficult to just focus on the financial perspective, because there are many fintech companies that are not only focusing or are carrying out activities in the financial sector, but the technology or the innovation they're introducing is not only financial in terms of payments or in terms of banking. It's the technology sometimes is related to artificial intelligence, to big data, to cloud computing, to biometry and digital identity. And these terms are very, very important. And from our perspective, it's very useful that we have some progress making in the financial sector towards these areas that also for other parts in the government and administration are very interested. I mean, digital identity is not a financial solution from the administration point of view, but probably the fintech companies in the private sector are the most advanced in the private sector developing digital identity, and this is something we can learn, and this is something we can introduce from the financial sector and regulation and authority and supervisory authorities to learn to other areas in the administration. And this is a very important point of view. And the third idea I wanted to highlight is just some examples in which we're beginning to collaborate, to introduce these technologies in the administration, and we're how can we materialize? I wanted to raise at least two examples. The first one recalls something that already Doris introduced, which is the importance of the supervision of anti-money laundering. Here, data is a key issue, and what we are introducing, or the steps we're taking, are trying to collaborate with fintech solutions, outsourcing the study of and the access to big data that otherwise couldn't be processed from the authorities in the administration. And this is a way of collaboration. It's not the administration introducing the technology, as Doris said. This is quite difficult, and we will need some more time to do it. But we're finding the way to collaborate through the outsourcing of this exploring and the interpretation of data, of course, with and which is most important is the access to data we don't have, and here is a key issue. And fintech companies do have this data. And the second example is a very difficult, a very different one. Is the experience we had a couple of years ago with Alastria, which is a public permissioned multi-sector blockchain platform. This was a kind of experiment we carried out here in the Treasury, but also with the private sector and other entities in the with the financial sector and with Bank of Spain and other supervisors, which was just trying to set up a network, a blockchain network that could communicate and to learn the technology, to learn how it is implemented, how it is developed. And this is a very important experience, because afterwards, when MiCA came and we have to negotiate, we already had this experience, which is not something is actually communicating in terms of financial transactions, but we understand the technology which is behind, and I think it's an important perspective to understand and to have a very close experience with the technology. And this is the main ideas I wanted to highlight. We're at the beginning of this challenge, but there are a lot of compromise and a lot of people that is engaged in taking the right steps for this technology to introduce the advantages and the progress it can bring. Thank you.
Thanks, Andres. That's really interesting, and again, so many different aspects to that, and thank you for those kind of examples as well near the end. Just for members of the audience who aren't located within the EU, some of the acronyms we've been using, so MiCA and DORA, these are kind of crypto and digital resilience related sorry, something just flashed up to say I was muted. So hopefully that wasn't one of the audience. So as I was explaining, the MiCA, DORA, and some of these acronyms that have been used are coming from relevant for the I guess the 27 EU member states. But it's another example of kind of regulation maybe getting ahead of the when it comes getting ahead of the implementation. I like the line you used about, I'm paraphrasing slightly, but outsourcing of data ahead of outsourcing the technology, which leads me on to, we've had a couple of questions in. I know that Chris, you've answered one of them by the kind of the chat facility, but I just wanted to kind of announce the question. And Chris, I'll come to you first of all, just to talk as well about the answer. But thank you. The question is from Cara Rideout, and the question is, what approaches and considerations are being taken and evaluated or evaluated to account for inherent bias in technology? So that, I guess, that kind of slips into I guess bias in data as well. But Chris, thank you for the question, to the audience for the question, but Chris, you've already kind of responded to that by typing, but I just wondered if you wanted to pick up on that, and then maybe I'll go to Andres as well to pick up on that question.
Yeah, sure. It was this sort of particular problem of bias. I came across it. I was working with Microsoft actually at the time when I was at the BBC developing the BBC's voice assistant using speech to text, natural language understanding, and other capabilities around that. But also looking at even things like graph technology and how we organize our data. Is making sure you have these sort of balanced data sets. That means that so it's balanced data sets and testing frameworks so that you can keep an eye on introducing bias. So for some of the companies I've worked with in the past, it's a really big deal for them because they've seen firsthand how it can go horribly wrong as such. So I think that would be, so I talked earlier about making sure that we have sort of a robust framework in terms of how we use data as one of the sort of dimensions. And I think that the bias and understanding how bias gets introduced or injected into some of the more so probably sort of the machine learning and maybe RPA or AI technologies that we use is monitored. I think it's really key.
Is your sense, Chris, because data crosses all sorts of different government departments and obviously stretches way beyond fintech, can you almost centralize within government a function to assess how different departments should be dealing with bias? Because it seems more efficient to do it that way than have each, do you see what I mean, each different department within government.
Things like, I think things like machine learning principles and those sorts of things would be good as a sort of a set of principles or framework you can use across government, which is good. And it also allows governments across different countries to collaborate in a very sort of generic way, but that sort of level of appropriateness, I suppose. And it also helps to create those types of conversations, I think, because we also have to recognize that we all have very similar, let's say, departments as such that have maybe very similar data sets, but others may have broader sets of data. Others may have sort of more narrow, more specialized sets of data where the narrower the data is, that maybe the less bias can come in. But the broader set of data that we have could introduce different types of bias as such in that. So it really depends on the types of data that we're using for the types of sort of citizen-facing services that we're launching. But I think that a sort of a central sort of maybe machine learning framework or principles would be very sensible.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very daunting topic, especially for those kind of public servants and authorities who you know, are probably being asked to do more with less at the current time. And then there's all these questions that arise as well. I know at a previous webinar we had a representative from the UK's centre, I think it's the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, and there was a whole host of you know, initiatives, possibly international as well, I'm sure, that they were involved with. But Andres and Doris, I don't know if you want to come back on that audience question about bias. Andres, you are first to unmute, so Andres, to you first.
Yes, on technology, and this is also a point I raised in our meeting in Estonia, is that what is most important is not the technology itself, but the social relationship it creates and the confidence, and this is very key issue in finance, and the confidence the users of this technology are recognizing and are accepting. And when we call about any technology has bias, I will say cash is a kind of technology from the administration, and it's a very simple old technology, but it has bias. It has it's anonymous. It's something you can carry on. It's something that can be stolen. It's a technology that we have confidence on, but it has some troubles. It has some kind of advantages, and the key issue at the end of the day is that we accept that technology, and people accept, and people is confident in using that technology. And any solution we will find, any private public sector initiative, or people accept, like, and enjoy, and feel confident using that technology and the implications it had, or it will not transform, it will not be introduced, and this is something we are always keeping in mind. Everything we do needs to be understood by the society as a whole. We need to be clear, to be able to explain it, and people to understand how it works. Because if people don't trust, it won't work. And this is something that applies to everything. And so recognizing that and being very aware that any technology has bias, and a blockchain has bias. The use of data, it has, or it can introduce kind of different approaches on how we make decisions. But if we need to be clear on that, and from that perspective, I think that it is possible to find solutions that are safer, that are easier, and that we will help people to make life easier.
Thanks, Andres. We have a further question from the audience, which I'm going to come to next. But Doris, do you want to come in on the same topic as well?
Yeah, thank you. I would like to underline what Andres said in a way. Of course, we see that that public institutions have a lot of data and public services, and of course, we see that there could be potential for the usage of artificial intelligence services. However, the use of data by public institutions is also a very sensitive one, and that is very important to have that in mind. So, and there we are in the whole area of non-discriminatory governmental and public decision making. There we are in the area of privacy and data protection, and that is even more relevant in cases of machine learning which relies on a huge data set which could have biases. And I think that is exactly why it is important that we have some rules there. And I think this is something which is now on the agenda. That is why also a Data Protection Act from the European Commission also implies, of course, to services which rely on artificial intelligence. And that is why it's so important that the Commission now came up with the Artificial Intelligence Act, that gives at least which gives an indication of how balanced data sets should be, how transparent some mechanism of the analyzation of data should be. And it clearly says that there are some high-risk applications of artificial intelligence. And for no surprise, most of these high-risk application of artificial intelligence lies in the public field, in the public area. And therefore is, well, to sum it up, I think that's a very important point. When it comes to the use of artificial intelligence by public authority, one really has to be very sensitive what it is used and on which data is, the services are based on.
No, thanks, Doris. I want to look at a slightly separate issue now, which is the kind of pace of adoption. And Andres set this out quite clearly with his kind of, first we need to do this, then we need to do this, albeit, you know, you've given examples of kind of elements of kind of fintech update. And I think it's always said that legislation moves a lot more slower than technology, but the picture it's easy to have in your mind is that the growing number of fintech companies, which we've heard about, the growing number of fintech solutions that can be adopted by government, and yet sometimes we hear that, you know, maybe government isn't ready for different reasons to adopt them. The question we've had in which relates to this is what can be done to encourage more fintechs to design or refine their services for the use of central government. So I guess that there's two different debates here, which is government legislatively ready? Can it, you know, can it do it? But also to repeat that question, and then I'll go to Andres first. But the question is, what can be done to encourage more fintechs to design or refine their services for the use of central government? So when you hear fintechs are interested in providing services to government, I'm interested to hear of all those different areas, perhaps where they're most active. Is it in payments, for example? I don't know. But also, you know, how can the government help them, and how can fintechs help themselves, I guess. So Andres, I'll come to you first, if that's okay.
Yes.
Thank you for the question.
I will say that there are many areas in which fintechs can collaborate and offer services to the central government. Actually, there are probably many of them already doing this. And I will in areas in data is very clear. The governments have a lot of data, and we actually do very little use of that data. Not only for I mean, in terms of payments or of taxes or spending, also when we design policy. And this is probably where data is most valuable for us, is trying to understand what the society is doing, what is money spent, and on many areas when we need to design regulation. And this is very important, because as I mentioned, we need to change regulation to introduce and to adapt to the new technology, but we also need this technology, this data, this analysis to make that regulation clear and viable. Because otherwise, the regulation, if we regulate out of the box, if with no data analysis underneath, it is very difficult to do the right thing at the moment. And so the data for us is very, very valuable. But that's one area. Also on payments, on cloud computing, on artificial intelligence, there are many areas. I would say that pushing and offering and showing what technologies are and what solutions are already there. They're very useful for us.
Thank you. I'm going to ask just a very quick follow-up question to that, which is you referred earlier to, I think, the fintech sandbox that Spain's created, having had almost, so that's kind of a test space thought for new fintech projects that a lot of countries have now established. And I think you mentioned that almost 100 projects have now gone through that. I guess a lot of them are not really relevant for government. They're relevant for governments in a regulatory sense, but not really relevant for governments in a delivering services sense. It's a very difficult question for me to put to you, but in that sandbox, I guess you're aware of a lot of the projects. Are there some of those that instinctively you think, this could be good for a government, services solution in some way?
In this sense, it is a sandbox for fintech and financial services sector. As far as the central government does not provide financial services to customers, this is more distance that needs to be there's more distance in these solutions and the things we're doing from the central government perspective. But, and this is probably the way I would like to point out, the financial sandbox in Spain was the first one to be launched, but afterwards there are other sandboxes in other areas such as transportation, also digital and artificial intelligence. There are other sandboxes, and in transportation and mobility, which is a key issue for regional and local governments, having a sandbox that the experience from our sandbox is being used for some services that are centrally regulated or provided. There we have solutions that could be implemented directly, not only in terms of regulating the mobility or the transportation at the local level, but also there are solutions that could be implemented by public entities in this regard.
Thanks. Thank you for that example. That's very interesting, of not necessarily central government procuring a fintech solution, but it's an example of central government setting up the kind of regulatory spaces with actually financial services in that example kind of leading the way. Looking at the clock, we've got just over 10 minutes left, and I do want to kind of go around us all again for our kind of, I suppose, closing observations. But if I can go over to either Doris or Chris, just to pick up if you like the opportunity on the question that we were looking at before. Chris, you raised an arm, so Chris, I'll go to you, and then to Doris on the question that was asked previously.
Thanks, Ian. I was just picking up on the point that Andreas was talking about the sandbox. I think that's a fantastic idea, because what it does is it allows us to have that sort of test the problem that we're trying to solve, but also setting up those startups. If we introduce startups, we set them up to succeed, and that's really important. So we can start to look at what are the legislative boundaries that we're working with, understand what might need to change in order to take things to the next level, but also making sure that the outcomes are really positive. Because then I think sometimes we might work with startups or something, we basically set them up to fail, because it's like, this is never going to happen, because actually we're starting with technology first and not necessarily the problem. So I love the fact that you've set up a sandbox idea. So it's a really sort of safe space to problem solve. So it's not just thinking about the technology angle. There's the legislation issues, there's general application and change and impact, I suppose, to businesses. So I think that's a great idea for bringing new tech into government.
Take the opportunity to mention that our sandbox is not only for Spanish companies, but also for companies from all over the world. And we have some experience from companies, actually one from the UK. So I think let's take the opportunity of this forum to advertise the possibility of UK companies also to apply for our sandbox and to get tested in the EU regulation and Spanish regulation. So
love to hear more about that. That'd be fantastic.
And actually, Chris, that both of you are answering that question. What can be done to encourage more fintechs to design or refine their services? The very establishment of these sandboxes is precisely to do that, is to enable the regulators and the companies to interact and ultimately become regulated and provide their services in a kind of in a safe way. I suppose the next step is, when they've done that, is to try and find opportunities in central government. But before we I guess go round for a final time with your kind of closing thoughts on where the big opportunities but also challenges are, I think to maybe accelerate some of the adoption within central government. Doris, do you have any comments on where we've been for the last kind of 5 or 10 minutes?
Yes, thank you very much Ian, for the question. Well, I think 2 points on this issue. First, I think public or governments probably need to explain very clearly what services they do need and what services in which area they could think of using fintechs. Because I sometimes got the impression that it's from the outside, especially for the private sector, not always easy to understand how governments really function when they provide services, and what are the restraints we are in and under which we could only provide services. And that starts, of course, with our public goal to serve the greater public, and to have a non-discriminatory access to services, and to also have some certain additional limitations on maybe privacy issues. And these are all things which could differ to private sector solutions. And therefore, I think the first thing is that we as governments have to explain very good and clear what services we do need. And that the second point is, I think we also have to understand which services we could need from an innovation point of view. So to say, to better understand what is possible from a technical perspective and what could be improved, or how could our services be improved, because we are the experts on our services as they are designed and processed for the last, well, I wouldn't say 200 years, but for quite a long time. Fintechs, however, are the experts on saying how maybe to readjust our processes to be more efficient and maybe to provide better services. And I think that is the other side of the medal. So 2 things, I think fintechs, or we need to explain very clearly what the restraints and services are that governments could provide or public institutions could provide. Second, we have to learn which solutions are on the market and from which we could really, as a government and as a society as a whole, then benefit.
Thanks, Doris. I almost think that answer is kind of also kind of could almost potentially serve as your kind of closing observations as well, because I think you've kind of summarized really where you are in Germany. So maybe I can take that as your closing remark, actually, potentially. But I'll go to Chris then and kind of your spin on maybe what Doris has just said, but just to close by re-asking the kind of the title of the webinar, which is where is the greatest potential for central government's use of fintech solutions. From obviously you started by listing a lot of areas particularly that you're kind of most interested in, but just a final opportunity to kind of summarize your answer to the question, really, and then I'll come to Andreas and then we'll close.
Okay, so I think that actually, in terms of the way the theme of this conversation has gone is not necessarily what is the one opportunity. I think it's very clear that there are opportunities, technologies, a broad set of technologies and players in the market. It's very, very broad, equally broad across opportunities, technologies, and suppliers. Technology maturity is clearly going to vary across all of those capabilities. And if there are 14,000 of them in terms of startups, then how do you navigate that? We also know that the agility of fintech suppliers is also going to vary. We also talked about a shared set of principles across government. I think is useful to help to help with adoption. So I think we need to create the right conditions for fintech to thrive in government. Is the right thing to do, but not by choosing technology. It's defining the problem that we're trying to solve. So I think for me, it's let's create the right conditions so that we can set everyone up to succeed is the key thing for me.
Yeah, that's really a really good summary. I think that's very similar to really what Doris had said as well, actually, which is sometimes it's less start with the technology and put out there the kind of problems that you're looking to solve. Andres, over to you for potentially the final word before I close things.
Yes, I will tend to agree with Doris and Chris. I think the opportunities are many, and there is a lot of that can be done. And the greatest risk is actually don't doing anything. And we need to learn that this technology, it will come. There are solutions, there are challenges that we need to face, and these fintech solutions, they're probably the right answer to some challenges for the citizens, for governments, and that's the reason why we need to collaborate. And we are actually very open to do so, and we're very aware that if we don't do it, we will miss a great opportunity.
Thanks, Andres. You really get, as I hear that kind of, I think we're all aligned that the opportunities, we can see the opportunities, but it's just, I think the COVID case, that the COVID disbursements case study is an interesting one, isn't it? Where those solutions really came to the fore, but in some countries they were very much used, and we had the webinar a couple of days ago that was showcasing, I think, some of those. In other cases, maybe for legislative or cultural reasons, those that could buy in the solutions aren't quite doing that yet, but you can kind of see the momentum. Doris, would you like any kind of final remark? I know I kind of wrapped your closing remark in your previous answer, but anything closing from yourself?
Thank you very, very much for giving me the opportunity, but I have to admit, I think everything has been said so far from us, so nothing.
Great. Okay.
Then.
No problem. Didn't want to make sure you didn't have the opportunity. So thank you, everyone. We're bringing things to a close, and thank you to the three of you on the panel, and also all of you in the audience for watching. Thank you for your questions. I understand that the team has already sent you an email asking for feedback, and it'd be fantastic if you could just take a moment to complete it. If you've registered to attend, you'll also receive a link to the video recording, and we'll be publishing an article capturing the key messages. As you can see on screen, our next webinar for Global Government FinTech is on the 13th of December, and that's called Shedding Light on Dark Money, How Can Governments Tackle Illicit Finance? So do sign up if that's a topic that interests you. You can also find the details on the Global Government FinTech website and the website of our sister title, Global Government Forum. But thank you to our panel for joining us. Thank you again to the audience, and have a fantastic rest of the day. Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you very much.